Revenge with Avon. I didn't come to Blackridge Capital to make friends, and I definitely didn't come to play small, but I still remember the exact moment they decided I was entertainment instead of a person. My first Monday, the glass doors opening like a mouth, the lobby smelling like money and lemon polish, and a man in a perfect suit looking me up and down as if I'd wandered in from the street. His name was Grant Halstead, Senior VP, the kind of man who smiled with his teeth but never with his eyes, and when he shook my hand, he held it half a second too long, like he wanted me to feel the weight of him. Then he glanced at my badge, Mara Reyes, Compliance Analyst, and laughed softly, like the job title was a joke, like I was a joke. And behind him, his little crowd of assistants and junior associates did the same. A chain reaction of polite cruelty. Compliance, Grant repeated, slow and mocking. So you're here to tell us not to have fun. And I heard myself answer with a calm I didn't fully feel. I'm here to make sure the fun doesn't turn into prison. But it was too late. He'd already decided what I was for. A punching bag with a college degree. They gave me a desk in the back. Under a vent that rattled like it was trying to warn me, and when I asked for access to the vendor risk portal, it told me my request didn't go through, even though I'd watched the email send, and when I followed up with Grant's assistant, she smiled sweetly and said, "He's been so busy, Mara, maybe try again next week." Like my job was a favor I'd asked for, instead of a responsibility the firm legally needed, I worked anyway. Because that's what I do. I build solutions with what I have, I make a path where there isn't one, and by the end of week 1, I'd already found small things that made my stomach tighten, a travel reimbursement that didn't match receipts, a third-party contract missing a standard background check, a set of consulting fees routed through a shell that existed only on paper. Nothing that screamed yet, but enough to whisper that the building was hollow behind the marble, and whispers are what I've always trusted. Because I grew up learning how secrets move. My mother cleaned offices downtown, and when she took me with her on weekends, I watched executives leave their power on their desks in the form of files and sticky notes and careless conversations. And I understood even at 12 that the people who looked untouchable were often the messiest. Still, I kept my head down, did my job, smiled when they made jokes about how I probably called the cops on jaywalkers, and swallowed my anger when Grant started tossing comments into meetings like darts. "Let's ask compliance, Mom," he'd say, and everyone would chuckle. "Mara, is it illegal to breathe in this room?" And I'd answer the actual question. Because that's how you survive predators. You don't react the way they want. You stay boring to them. But boredom didn't stop him. It just made him more creative. 2 weeks in, he invited me to a conference room and handed me a stack of files like it was a gift. "Special project," he said. "I need you to sign off on these vendor onboarding forms by Friday." And I flipped through and felt my throat dry out because half of them were incomplete. Missing beneficial ownership disclosures, missing AML checks, missing insurance. "I can't sign off on these," I said, keeping my voice even. "They're not compliant." And his smile tightened. "Mara," he said softly, "I didn't ask what you can't do. I asked what you will do." And for a second, the room felt smaller. Like the glass walls were closing in, I thought of my rent, my student loans, the way my mother's hands cracked in winter because she never bought gloves, and I thought of the reason I'd taken this job in the first place, because I'd promised myself I would never be the person who looks away just to stay employed. "I won't sign," I said, "but I'll tell you exactly what's missing, and how fast we can fix it." And Grant's eyes went cold. He leaned back and folded his hands like a judge. "You're going to be a problem," he said, not loud, but clear. And I knew then that he wasn't joking anymore. The next day, my badge stopped working for the executive floor. The day after that, my meeting invites disappeared from my calendar. And the day after that, I got pulled into HR by a woman named Denise, who wore perfume so sharp it felt like a warning. "We've received feedback," Denise said, "that you're struggling with culture fit." And Grant sat beside her, quiet, watching me like. He was waiting for me to flinch. "Culture fit," I repeated, tasting the phrase, because I wouldn't sign incomplete compliance forms. And Denise gave a sad little smile, like she was sorry I didn't understand how the world worked. "It's more than that," she said. "Your communication style can come across rigid." And Grant finally spoke. "We're a high-performance environment," he said. "We need team players." And I realized in that moment that the firm wasn't afraid of rules. They were afraid of anyone who actually followed them. I left that meeting with my job technically intact and my target painted brighter. I started documenting everything the way my old mentor taught me. Screenshots, dates, email chains, version. Histories, meeting notes typed immediately afterward. I wasn't planning revenge yet. I was planning survival. Because the first rule of corporate war is simple. If someone has the power to ruin you, you make sure the truth can't be buried with you. For a while, it was quiet. Almost too quiet. Grant stopped teasing me openly and started doing something worse. He started pretending I wasn't there. People I'd chatted with in the break room stopped making eye contact. My manager, a soft-spoken man named Joel, suddenly forgot to include me on important calls, and when I asked questions, I got vague answers that led nowhere, like they wanted me wandering in circles until I got tired and quit. Then, late one Thursday, an email hit my inbox with the subject line urgent, signature required, sent from Grant, and copied to the CFO, the general counsel, and Denise in HR. Attached was a one-page memo that looked official, with my name typed under a paragraph that read, "Compliance has reviewed and approved expedited onboarding of vendors for Q4 initiatives." And at the bottom was a blank signature line, my signature line. It was a trap, clean and simple. If I refused, I'd be labeled uncooperative in front of leadership. If I signed, I'd be the fall person when the truth surfaced. My hands didn't shake. But my heart did that heavy drop, like a stone. I replied in writing, calm and direct, with a list of missing items and a note that I could not approve without them. Then I saved the email and the attachment to 3 different places. An hour later, Joel called me into his office and shut the door. He looked like he hadn't slept, Mara. He said, "Why are you doing this?" And I stared at him, trying to decide if he was scared for me or for himself. Doing what? I asked. He swallowed. "Making enemies," he said. And I felt something in me harden. "I'm not making enemies," I said. "I'm doing my job." And Joel rubbed his forehead like I'd said something childish. "This place isn't fair," he whispered. "They'll crush you." And that was the first time someone at Blackridge admitted the truth out loud. I left his office and went back to my desk. And that night I stayed late. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I needed space to think. Outside, the city lights shimmered like broken glass. And inside, the office was a quiet hum of machines and distant janitor carts. I pulled up the vendor list again and traced patterns, names repeating across different entities, addresses that matched mail drops, invoice numbers that didn't follow normal sequencing, approvals that happened too fast for normal process. It started to form a picture. And the picture was ugly. Grant wasn't just bullying me. He was hiding something, and I realized, with a cold clarity, that this wasn't about culture fit at all. This was about making sure the one person who noticed the cracks got shoved out before the whole wall came down, I could have walked away. Then, I could have updated my URSUM, applied quietly, escaped with my dignity, but the thought made my stomach twist, because walking away wouldn't just save me, it would leave everyone else exposed. The clients whose retirement funds were tied up in the firm's deals. The employees who'd take the blame when the scandal hit. The people like my mother, who trusted professional companies to be professional, I opened my notes and wrote one sentence. If they want me gone, they're afraid of what I can see. That became my anchor. The next morning, I did something that felt small, but was the first real move. I scheduled a standard quarterly compliance review presentation and invited leadership, including the general counsel, under the normal pretext of process improvements. Grant couldn't object without looking suspicious. When he saw the invite, he walked to my desk and leaned over. His voice low. "Cancel it," he said. "It's routine," I answered. His smile returned, thin and dangerous. "Routine gets people fired," he said. And then he walked away like he owned the air. That weekend, I didn't sleep much. I rechecked everything twice. Then 3 times I built a timeline. I mapped vendor relationships. I pulled publicly available corporate records. I compared them to internal files. I found overlaps that shouldn't exist. And late Sunday night, I discovered the piece that made my blood run cold. A vendor called Helix Advisory. Consultants paid millions for market intelligence, connected through an LLC to a property address that, when searched, led to a residential home in a quiet suburb, the kind of home someone would buy when they were hiding money, not earning it honestly. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, because I knew what this meant. Someone inside Blackridge was siphoning funds through fake vendors. And if I walked into that room on Monday with my little presentation, I wouldn't be challenging office politics. I'd be stepping into a machine designed to eat witnesses. Monday arrived with a sky the color of steel. And when I entered the conference room, the leadership table was already filled. The general counsel, Miss Whitaker, sat with her laptop open and a sharp, unreadable face. The CFO, Henry Bell, sat stiffly, checking his watch. Denise from HR sat like she was attending a funeral. Grant leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident. As if he already knew how this ended, I started calmly, talking about process, about standard onboarding controls, about how good compliance protects growth. I watched Grant's eyes glaze with pretend boredom, watched the others drift. Then I shifted, gently, into specifics, missing disclosures, expedited approvals, repeated exceptions. The room sharpened, Henry. "Looked up, miss." Whitaker's fingers paused over her keyboard, and Grant's posture changed, barely. But I saw it. I didn't accuse. I didn't say fraud. I simply asked questions that the data demanded. Why would we waive beneficial ownership checks for high-risk vendors? I said, why do we have multiple entities using the same mailing address? I said, why are consulting invoices paid within 24 hours when our policy requires 15-day review? And the air turned heavy. Grant cleared his throat and smiled. "Mara," he said, "this is above your pay grade." And in that moment I felt fear. Yes, but also something steadier. Purpose. Respectfully, I said, legal exposure is everyone's pay grade. And Miss? Whitaker's eyes flicked to me, the smallest sign of approval. Grant interrupted again. Voice sharper. "This is a waste of leadership time," he snapped, and Henry finally spoke. "Is it a waste?" Henry asked. "Or is it a problem?" And Grant's smile slipped for the first time. The meeting ended with no fireworks, no confession, just tense silence and vague promises to review. But as everyone filed out, Miss Whitaker stayed behind. "Miss Reyes," she said quietly, "send me your supporting documentation." And my heart kicked hard, because that was the sound of a door cracking open. Grant waited in the hall, arms crossed, eyes like storm clouds. "You just made a very expensive mistake," he said, low enough that only I could hear. I met his stare. "Then it's good I documented it," I said, and his jaw tightened. That afternoon, my access was revoked. Email, network drive, everything, like someone flipped a switch. Within an hour, Denise appeared at my desk with a practiced smile. "Mara," she said, "we need to escort you out while we investigate a security concern." And the office around me went quiet. heads turning like I was being arrested. A security guard appeared at my side, polite but firm. And I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Not shame, not guilt, but fury at the theater of it. The way they tried to turn integrity into a spectacle. I stood slowly and picked up my bag. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply said, "Please provide this request in writing," and Denise's smile twitched. As I walked out, I felt Grant watching me, satisfied, and for half a second the fear returned, because being escorted out of A. Corporate building feels like being erased, but then my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "It's worse than you think. I can help. Jay." I kept walking, the cold air hitting my face as I stepped outside, and I realized this story was no longer about me proving myself in a hostile workplace. This was about something bigger, darker, and far more dangerous. A system built to steal and then bury anyone who noticed. And as I stood on the sidewalk, the city roaring around me like nothing had changed, I made a quiet promise to myself. They could take my badge, they could take my desk, they could try to take my name, but they were not going to take the truth. Because the truth was already out of their hands, I had backups, timestamps, records, and now, apparently, an insider willing to talk. Grant Halstead thought he'd humiliated me, thought he'd ended my career with one clean shove out the door. But he didn't understand something simple about people like me. When you grow up watching powerful men leave their secrets on their desks, you learn that the smallest overlooked detail can bring down a palace, and I was done being the detail they overlooked. The first night after they escorted me out, I didn't sleep at all, not because I was panicking the way they expected, but because my mind wouldn't slow down, every thought clicking into the next like gears, finally aligning. And I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the city humming outside, rereading the message from Jay over and over until the meaning settled in my bones. Because an insider reaching out meant two things at once. I wasn't crazy, and this was bigger than even I thought. I didn't reply right away. I learned long ago that haste is how you get trapped. So instead, I checked my backups again, making sure every file was intact, encrypted, duplicated in places no purge could touch. Then, I drafted a clean timeline of events from my first day at Blackridge to the moment security walked me out. Not emotional, not angry, just facts lined up like dominoes. Because facts are patient and they don't care who stands in front of them. Around 2 a.m., I finally texted back, simple and cautious, "Who are you?" And the reply came almost instantly, like he'd been waiting. Someone who signed things I shouldn't have. Someone Grant told would be protected. That sentence told me everything I needed to know about the fear on the other side of the screen. The kind of fear that turns obedience into a reflex, and I felt a strange mix of sympathy and steel. Because I knew that fear, but I also knew what it cost to live inside it. We agreed to talk, though. Next day, not by phone, not by email, but in person, and we chose a place that made sense for two people who didn't want to be overheard. A diner near the river where the coffee was bad, and the booths were cracked vinyl, and no one looked at anyone too closely. He showed up late, nervous, scanning the room like he expected Grant to burst through the door, and when he slid into the booth across from me, I saw a man in his early 40s with the posture of someone who'd been shrinking for years. "I'm Jonah," he said, voice low, and he wrapped both hands around his mug like it was the only solid thing left in his world. Jonah worked in operations, close enough to the money to see it move, far enough from power to never question why. And as he talked, the picture sharpened. Expedited vendors weren't exceptions. They were the system. Shell companies weren't anomalies. They were. Pipelines, approvals weren't rushed. They were rubber stamped. Grant didn't act alone, but he acted with confidence. The confidence of a man who knew exactly who would look away and who would get burned. They told us, Compliance was slowing growth, Jonah said, eyes down. That you didn't understand the bigger picture, and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was always the same story dressed up in better suits. What happens now? He asked, and that was the moment the weight of it all settled on my shoulders. Because revenge isn't just about striking back. It's about deciding how far you're willing to go and what you're willing to risk now. I said carefully, we do this right. And I explained my plan, not dramatic, not reckless, but methodical. No leaks to the press yet. No anonymous tips that could be dismissed. Just a clean, undeniable record handed to the people legally required to act. Jonah listened, nodding slowly, and when he finally said, "They'll destroy us," I met his eyes and answered the truth he needed to hear, not the comfort he wanted. "They'll try," I said, "but only if we let them control the timeline," and timelines, I'd learned, were everything. Over the next 2 weeks, my life became a quiet war. I didn't post on social media, didn't update my LinkedIn, didn't tell friends what was really happening. I became a ghost with a purpose. Jonah fed me documents, approval chains, internal chats, payment logs, and every file matched the patterns I'd already seen, tightening the net until there was no room left for coincidence. At the same time, Blackridge moved fast to rewrite the story of me. Former coworkers stopped responding entirely, and one brave junior analyst warned me that Grant was concerned about my emotional stability, planting the seeds of a narrative that painted me as unstable, disgruntled, dangerous, the classic preemptive strike against a whistleblower. The irony didn't escape me, but I didn't react, because reacting publicly would have been the mistake they wanted. Instead, I filed a formal complaint with the sex whistleblower office, precise and documented, and then another with the firm's external auditor, copying only what was necessary. Nothing extra, because restraint makes truth stronger, not weaker. The waiting was the hardest part, because when you light a fuse this long, you have to trust it will burn the way it's supposed to. In the meantime, the pressure came in smaller, uglier ways. A letter from Blackridge's legal team arrived accusing me of violating confidentiality agreements, the language aggressive and vaguely threatening, and for a moment, just a moment, the old fear tried to crawl back in. The fear of being buried under legal fees, of watching my savings evaporate while men like Grant slept soundly in there. Houses with gates and guards. I took the letter to a lawyer recommended by a friend, a woman named Elise with sharp eyes and a voice that never rose. She read it once, then smiled thinly. "They're scared," she said, "and sloppy." And hearing that from someone who'd seen real monsters steadied me. In a way I hadn't expected, Elise handled the response, firm and unmoved, and after that the letter stopped, replaced by silence, which was somehow worse, because silence meant movement behind the scenes. Jonah started to crack under the strain, calling me late at night, voice shaking, convinced. He was being followed, that his badge would stop working any day now, the way mine had. I didn't minimize his fear, because that would have been cruel. Instead, I reminded him of what he'd already done, the line he'd already crossed. "They can't unsee you now," I told him, "so you might as well stand where you can breathe." And slowly, painfully he did. Then one gray morning, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately, Miss Whitaker. Her tone was neutral, professional, but there was something underneath it now, something alert. "Miss Reyes," she said, "we have some questions." And that was how I knew the machine had finally noticed the sand in its gears. The meeting took place in a neutral office downtown, not at Blackridge, and when I walked in, I didn't feel triumphant, I felt calm, which surprised me, because calm is what? Comes when you know you've already done the hardest part. Miss Whitaker wasn't alone. An external investigator sat beside her, flipping through a thick binder that looked suspiciously familiar. "Your documentation is thorough. the investigator said, and I allowed myself a small private smile. I answered their questions honestly, clearly, without embellishment, and when they asked why I hadn't signed the memo Grant sent, I said simply, because it would have been a lie, and no one challenged that. Weeks passed again, heavy and quiet, until the news broke in a way no one at Blackridge could spin. A regulatory inquiry announced, shares dipping. Analysts asking questions leadership couldn't answer with buzzwords. My phone lit up with messages from people who'd once ignored me. Sudden friendliness dripping from every word, and I ignored them all. Because forgiveness can wait until accountability shows up first, Jonah was placed on. Administrative leave pending review. But instead of panic, his voice held something new when he called me. Relief, like the weight he'd been carrying was finally being set down. Grant, meanwhile, vanished from public view. No interviews, no statements. His LinkedIn mysteriously updated to on. Sabbatical, which in our world is just a softer word for cornered. I watched it all from a distance, not celebrating, not gloating, just observing the slow, inevitable shift as power recalibrated itself away from the man who thought it was permanent, and in the middle of it, something unexpected happened. A recruiter reached out, not from some desperate firm willing to take a risk on a troublemaker, but from a company with a reputation for real integrity. We heard about what you did, she said, not as a warning, but as a compliment, and for the first time since this began, I felt the future crack open in a way that wasn't defined by reaction, but even then, even with doors opening, I didn't feel finished. Because revenge, the real kind, isn't loud or flashy. It's watching the system that tried to erase you slowly publicly correct itself around the truth you refuse to let go of. Grant had tried to make me invisible, to reduce me to a cautionary tale whispered in hallways. But instead, he turned me into a mirror, and companies hate mirrors. Because they show you exactly who you are, the investigation deepened, subpoenas followed, and one afternoon as I stood in my kitchen again, phone buzzing with another update, I realized something that felt like a quiet victory. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had fueled the first steps, but clarity had carried me the rest of the way. They hadn't broken me when they walked me out of that building, and they weren't breaking me now. They were breaking themselves, slowly, methodically, under the weight of their own choices, and as I looked out at the city, the same city that had watched me get escorted out like a criminal weeks earlier, I knew the final act was coming, not because I needed it for closure, but because systems built on lies always collapse eventually. The only question left was how loudly Blackridge would fall, and how many people Grant Halstead would try to take down with him when he realized there was nowhere left to hide. By the time the collapse finally came, it didn't arrive like an explosion, but like a long overdue confession the building itself could no longer hold. And I was sitting in a borrowed office with bare white walls when Elise forwarded me the headline that would change everything, my name not in it, but my fingerprints all over the truth. Blackridge Capital under federal investigation for vendor fraud and executive misconduct. And I stared at the words until they blurred. Not because I was shocked, but because I understood what those words really meant for the people inside that firm who had laughed, ignored, threatened, and underestimated me. Phones rang nonstop after that. Reporters sniffing for a face to attach to the story. Former colleagues suddenly eager to clarify old interactions. Even distant relatives texting congratulations like I'd won something. But I didn't answer any of it right away. Because the loudest moment of revenge is often the quietest one, the moment you don't need to explain yourself anymore. The firm issued a bland internal memo about full cooperation and commitment to transparency, the kind of language designed to soothe shareholders while hiding panic. But behind that polished veneer the machine was tearing itself apart. Compliance reviews frozen, payments halted, deals collapsing under scrutiny, and I heard from Jonah, now officially protected under whistleblower statutes, that entire departments were scrambling to recreate. Documentation that no longer mattered, because once investigators see the pattern, no amount of paper can erase it. Grant Halstead resurfaced briefly, issuing a statement through his attorney denying wrongdoing and blaming procedural misunderstandings. And for a moment, I felt a familiar flicker of rage, because men like him always believe they can talk their way out of gravity. But that feeling passed when the second shoe dropped, his personal accounts frozen, his emails subpoenaed, his name quietly removed from the firm's website like he'd never existed, the power he once wielded so, casually evaporated in real time, and I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. I watched from the outside as Blackridge tried to sacrifice smaller players to protect the core, mid-level executives quietly terminated without cause. Public apologies drafted and redrafted. But the investigators weren't interested in symbolic offerings. They wanted architects, not laborers. And the more Grant tried to deflect, the clearer his role became. I testified once, calmly, factually, sitting across from people who took notes without judgment. And when they asked me why I hadn't walked away earlier, why I'd stayed when it became clear the firm was hostile, I answered with the truth I'd been carrying since my first week there. Because leaving wouldn't have made me safe. It would have just made the lie safer. After that, the waiting returned. But this time, it felt different. Less like dread, and more like standing on the shore watching a storm you know will pass. Jonah's voice changed when he called now, steadier, lighter, and he told me about the office after Grant's final removal. How people spoke in whispers, not about me, but about themselves, about the things they'd ignored because it was easier than risking comfort, and hearing that mattered more to me than any public vindication, because accountability doesn't start with punishment, it starts with recognition. The firm's board eventually announced sweeping leadership changes, consultants hired to rebuild trust, glossy statements about new ethics initiatives rolling out like fresh paint over cracked walls. And while part of me wanted to scoff, another part understood the truth. Systems don't change overnight, but they do change when enough light is forced into their corners. My own life, strangely, began to expand again in the spaces where fear used to live. The recruiter's call turned into interviews into an offer, and when I accepted a role at a company that didn't treat integrity like an inconvenience, I felt something close to peace. Not because I'd escaped, but because I'd chosen a future instead of running from a past. Still, the final reckoning came one afternoon when Elise called me with a tone I hadn't heard before, almost gentle. "They've reached a settlement," she said, and then she told me the numbers, the admissions, the restrictions placed on former executives, including Grant, who would never again hold a leadership role in a regulated financial institution. I closed my eyes and let that sink in, not savoring it, just acknowledging it. Because the truth is, revenge didn't look like him in handcuffs or a dramatic courtroom showdown. It looked like doors quietly closing for him while others opened for me. Weeks later, I ran into Grant by accident at a coffee shop near the courthouse. The kind of place neither of us would have chosen before, and for a split second our eyes met, recognition flickering across his face like a glitch. But there was no confrontation, no apology, no words at all. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way men do when the story they tell themselves about who they are finally collapses. And as he turned away, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't hate him anymore. Hatred would have kept him relevant, and he no longer was. What stayed with me instead was the quiet pride of knowing I hadn't become what he expected, hadn't compromised, hadn't played the role he'd written for me as the disposable obstacle, the story spread in fragments online, distorted and debated. And sometimes my name surfaced, sometimes it didn't, but I stopped correcting people. because the truth didn't need my protection anymore. Months later, Jonas sent me a photo of the river near that diner where we'd first met. The water calm, reflective, and he wrote, "Thank you for not letting me disappear." And I stared at that message longer than any headline, because that was the part of this I hadn't anticipated. The way standing up for yourself can quietly give others permission to stand too. On the anniversary of the day I was escorted out of Blackridge, I took myself to dinner. Nothing fancy, just a small table by a window, and as the city moved around me, indifferent and alive, I thought about my mother, about the offices she cleaned, and the power she never had, but the values she passed down anyway, and I wished she could see how far those values had carried me. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no applause, no parade, just a life reclaimed from the hands of people who thought rules were optional and consequences were for someone else. And in that simplicity, I found the deepest satisfaction of all. They had tried to make me invisible, to rewrite me as a cautionary footnote in their success story, but instead I'd become the line they couldn't erase. The moment their narrative broke, karma, I learned, doesn't rush, and it doesn't shout. It waits until the lie is comfortable enough to expose itself, and then it lets gravity do the rest. And as I walked home that night, lighter than I'd been in years, I understood that revenge isn't about destroying someone else's life. It's about refusing to let them destroy yours, about choosing truth over fear, even when it costs you everything in the moment. Because sometimes, if you hold the line long enough, the line holds you back.
This story proves that quiet moves beat loud egos every time. Thanks for watching.